Have you ever watched someone be humiliated and felt the ache of silence in your throat, the guilt of inaction? Have you ever seen dignity stripped in plain view, not by violence, but by the smirking cruelty of those who never learned what sacrifice means? This is not just a story about an old man in a wrinkled flannel shirt, sipping black coffee alone in the corner of a cafe. It's the story of Sergeant Raymond Cole, a man who once threw himself over a child to shield her from an explosion, who survived the weight of war only to return to a world too distracted to care. It's about the quiet strength of a soldier who didn't raise his voice when mocked, who didn't flinch when scalded, and whose silence thundered louder than any shout. But it's also about what happened next, when one act of cruelty unraveled into a wave of reckoning, when strangers remembered what respect looks like, when a city looked inward and found the courage to change. It's about legacy, redemption, and the simple power of being seen. If you've ever wondered whether quiet dignity still matters in a loud world, if you've ever doubted whether one person's grace can spark a movement, Raymond's story is your answer. The young man didn't speak kindly. His voice sliced through the low hum of the morning cafe like a blade. "Wake up, old man. This isn't a shelter." Without waiting for a response, he upended a full cup of scalding coffee over the veteran's bowed head. A ripple of laughter followed. Not loud, more a collective exhale of disbelief and awkward amusement, the kind that stings more than it comforts. The old man flinched, his spine stiffening as the hot liquid soaked into his scalp and shirt. His eyes snapped open, lids blinking rapidly from the sting. But he didn't yell. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't curse. He simply sat there, drenched and still, as if the world hadn't just shifted into cruelty. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he reached for a napkin and gently patted his face dry. His movements were slow, deliberate, not because of frailty, but because he had long learned the discipline of restraint. He had known worse. Minutes passed, and then the cafe door creaked open. A man in a dark suit stepped inside. His face was pale, like all the blood had drained from it, and his steps faltered the moment he spotted the old man in the corner booth. He dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the cafe. His voice cracked. "Sergeant Raymond Cole?" Every conversation ceased. Forks paused midair. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. All eyes turned. The boy who had dumped the coffee, the one who had mocked, laughed, filmed, stared blankly. That man on his knees was his father. Raymond Cole sat alone in the booth beside the wide windows of Irene Bowles' cafe. His flannel shirt, worn soft from years of hard use, clung damply to his frame. His hands that once carried rifles, mended engines, and lifted wounded friends, rested calmly on the table, one near a half-drunk mug of black coffee. The morning sunlight stretched long and golden through the buffet's windows, painting the scratched wooden floors and faded gray tiles in warm tones. His eyes had been shut just moments earlier, leaning slightly against the wall, stealing a moment of stillness before another long shift at the docks. At 68, Raymond didn't move quickly anymore, but he moved with purpose. Every motion he made bore the weight of memory. His fingernails were stained from grease that never quite washed out. His knuckles told silent stories, some mechanical, some violent. Pinned to his collar, nearly hidden from view, was a small, tarnished Purple Heart. Irene Bowles' cafe, perched on the corner of Madison and Sycamore, had become his sanctuary. Most came to the cafe to plug into life, to study, to flirt, to document breakfast like it was performance art. But Raymond came for the opposite. He came for the quiet, for the ritual, a cup of strong coffee, 30 minutes of peace, a booth where no one asked what war had cost him. But today, that quiet had been shattered. Ethan Caldwell had swaggered in around 8 a.m., trailing behind 3 fraternity brothers, all of them overly loud and clearly overdressed for eggs and toast. At 21, Ethan wore entitlement like a cologne. His shoes gleamed, his blazer was trendy in that effortless, moneyed way. And when he spotted Raymond sitting alone by the window, his lips curled into a smirk. "Look who's here again," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Place is starting to smell like a shelter bum." His friends chuckled. One reached for his phone and hit record, angling the camera for a clear view. Another slurped his latte like it was entertainment. Ethan didn't pause. He snatched the nearest mug, someone else's coffee, fresh and steaming, and stalked across the room. He didn't ask, didn't warn. "Wake up, old man. This isn't your living room," he sneered, then tilted the mug and poured it straight onto Raymond's head. Gasps followed. Silence dropped like a curtain. Raymond recoiled slightly, not from fear but from reflex. The coffee scalded his skin, ran down his collar. But it was the shame, not the heat, that burned deepest. He blinked slowly, then reached, without a word, for a napkin. His fingers shook faintly as he dabbed at the mess. His breath was even. His expression was unreadable. Ethan burst into laughter. "Guess he needed a warm wake-up," he announced, cocky and loud, expecting the room to echo with approval. His friends laughed, some half-heartedly. The phone kept recording. Some patrons looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. A few gave awkward chuckles. One woman shifted in her seat but didn't stand. Behind the counter, the barista froze mid-pour. She knew Ethan. His father donated heavily to the university. She bit her lip, said nothing. At a small table near the back, Angela Cruz watched it all. She wasn't wearing her VA badge today, just jeans and a cardigan. But the way Raymond held himself, even while soaked and humiliated, told her everything she needed to know. Angela had spent nearly 2 decades working with veterans. She knew the signs, the stillness in the eyes, the weight behind every silent breath. You could always spot them, even when they weren't trying to be seen. And today she saw him, sitting there in the corner booth, coffee dripping from his face, surrounded by the cold snickers of a generation that had never been taught the cost of silence. Kids who'd never known what it meant to carry something that couldn't be set down. She rose from her seat slowly, quietly. No grand gestures, no dramatic exit. She didn't glare at Ethan, didn't offer him a word, not because she didn't have something to say, but because she knew that kind of boy wouldn't hear her anyway. Speaking to him would only add oxygen to the fire he was trying to set. Instead, she stepped outside, the door clicking shut behind her, and pulled out her phone. Her contact list was short, purposefully so. No fluff, no fair weather friends, just the kind of people who understood that loyalty wasn't a word you used lightly. She dialed someone who still believed in honor, someone who understood that there were debts no amount of time or metals could ever settle. Back inside the diner, Raymond Cole sat still, soaked. He didn't move to defend himself, didn't look up, didn't give Ethan the satisfaction of a reaction. He simply reached for a napkin, flimsy, damp, and pitiful, and dabbed it against his face with slow, practiced care. Not because it helped much, but because it was something to do, something to hold on to. He didn't expect anyone to step in. Life had taught him long ago what followed pain: indifference. The sharp sting of humiliation, followed by the dead air of people pretending not to notice. Around him, conversations resumed, awkward and clipped, like a jukebox sputtering back to life after skipping a beat. A few guilty glances darted his way, but no one stood up. No one spoke. The laughter that had rung out like applause just minutes before was now replaced with a low murmur of regret. And still he said nothing. Not because he didn't have words, but because he'd learned long ago that some people aren't ready to understand, and no amount of truth could make them try. His hands moved on their own, muscle memory born from 1,000 small recoveries. He wiped the coffee from his neck, now cool against his skin. His fingers brushed a jagged scar near his collarbone. He paused just for a second. That one had come from a different kind of burn. Fallujah, 2007. A recon sweep through a part of town that didn't make the evening news. His unit was caught in a sudden crossfire, pinned down between dust-blown market stalls and the cracked walls of collapsed buildings. It wasn't the enemy fire that haunted them most. It was the chaos. The civilians, the children. The girl couldn't have been more than 7. She came out of nowhere, a flash of movement, blue scarf, bare feet, darting after a ball that had bounced into the open. Raymond had seen her too late to stop her from running, but just in time to reach her. He'd thrown himself over her, pulled her in, curled his body around her like a shield as the grenade went off just yards away. The pain hit instantly, sharp, molten, but he remembered the sound of her sobbing beneath him more than the heat. She'd stared up at him with wide, dry eyes, no longer crying, She'd reached up, one tiny hand trembling, and touched his cheek. "Shukran," she whispered. "Thank you." Then the world had gone dark. Now in the bright morning light of a cheap diner, Raymond blinked, napkin still crumpled in his hand. The room had gone quiet again, but not clean. The shame hung heavy, thick in the air, like smoke. And Ethan Caldwell stood nearby, barely a few feet away, basking in his cruelty like it was a joke worth telling. Raymond looked at him, not directly, but just enough to take in what he needed. A boy full of pride, empty of principle. A child who'd never had to learn the weight of restraint or the cost of stepping into the fire for someone else. He wouldn't know what sacrifice meant if it wrapped itself around him and dragged him through the dirt. Raymond's father had come back from Vietnam to a country that spit on him in airports, that called him names and crossed the street to avoid his eyes. Raymond had learned from that. He'd never wanted to be saluted. He didn't need thank yous or flags on his porch. He just wanted to raise his daughter Leah in peace, to keep his head down, to live a quiet life. But this morning was different. This wasn't war. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't some unpredictable firefight in a foreign country. This was a deliberate act of cruelty, served cold, delivered in public, with laughter. And even then, Raymond didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out, because dignity, like silence, was something hard-earned, and even harder to take away. Code. That was the discipline he lived by. Not the kind drilled into you during basic training with shouted orders and endless push-ups, but the kind forged slowly, year by year, until it stopped being about pride and started becoming something deeper. A kind of quiet honor that didn't demand recognition, didn't ask for applause. Pride became something internal, something fiercely protected, not by ego but by silence. And Raymond Cole had long ago mastered that silence. So he didn't react, didn't raise his voice, didn't stand up, didn't demand the room's attention. He simply sat there, soaked in coffee, his shirt stained and steaming. If the world wanted to look at him and see some broken fragment from a war they had already forgotten, let them. If they saw him as someone outdated, discarded, irrelevant, that was their failure, not his. No one in that cafe had lived what he'd lived. No one could take away what he had seen, the horrors he had endured, or the lives he had helped save. That was his alone. He quietly folded the ruined napkin into his hand, tucked it out of sight, and leaned back against the booth. The pain in his shoulder was sharp, a reminder of wounds that had never fully healed. But beneath it all, buried deep in the marrow of his spine, beneath the scars, the trauma, and the weight of years, something solid remained, something unshakable, the quiet center of a soldier who had never really left the battlefield. The world may have turned its back, but it would remember him again soon enough. Outside, Angela Cruz stepped into the soft glow of morning sunlight, her jaw clenched tighter than she realized. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket with practiced urgency, her thumb already scrolling through contacts. There were only a handful of names she trusted in moments like this. It didn't take long to find the one she needed. She tapped the screen. The line connected quickly. VA Regional. This is Sergeant Grayson. Grayson, it's Cruz, she said. We've got a situation. Civilian harassment of a decorated veteran. Public location. Staff didn't intervene. Possible burn injuries. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Name? Raymond Cole. Another pause. This one longer. Heavier. I'll make the calls, Grayson replied. Angela exhaled slowly. She ended the call and turned back toward the cafe, peering through the glass. Raymond was still there, hunched over, his hands quietly working at the mess on his collar. Another napkin, another attempt to clean what shouldn't have happened in the first place. She knew that look. She'd seen it more than once. The look of someone who had learned long ago that speaking up only made things worse, that it was safer to sit in silence, to carry pain like a second skin. Not because it didn't hurt, but because silence was armor, and he was still wearing his. Inside the cafe, something shifted. From the back hallway, Irene Bowl emerged, clipboard in hand. She brushed a strand of silver hair behind her ear as she walked toward the front counter, scanning the room like she always did. She'd owned this place nearly 4 decades. Nothing got past her. She noticed the tension immediately. The strange quiet, the stiffness in the barista's shoulders, the weight in the air. She followed the current straight to Raymond. Then she saw the spilled coffee, the mess, and most damning of all, Ethan Caldwell's smug, self-satisfied grin. "Can someone tell me what the hell just happened?" Irene's voice cut through the silence, loud enough to snap heads around. The barista hesitated, eyes wide. A guy spilled coffee on purpose. On Mr. Cole?" Irene's gaze sharpened. "You spilled coffee on him?" "Not me," the girl stammered. "Him," she pointed. Ethan sighed and rolled his eyes. He tossed his phone on the table with a loud thud. "It was just a joke. Relax." "A joke?" Irene's voice rose an octave. "You think pouring scalding hot coffee on a man in my cafe is funny? You think humiliating a veteran because I know who Raymond Cole is, you think that's something to laugh about?" Ethan opened his mouth, but one look at Irene's face stopped him cold. She didn't bluff, and she sure as hell didn't play polite. Her life had been built on more grit than most of these kids would ever know. Her brother died in Afghanistan. Her husband had served in Korea. And Raymond? He'd been coming here almost every week for nearly 10 years. She didn't just know him, she respected him. "Get out," she said, her voice trembling. Not with fear, but with fury. "Take your coffee, your smug attitude, and your spoiled entitlement, and get out of my cafe." "You can't just kick me out," Ethan sputtered. "I can, and I just did." The atmosphere shifted. Conversations quieted. The clinking of spoons and cups stopped. Eyes that had previously looked away now turned, watching. Some with surprise, others with something more. Recognition. A man near the back stood slightly. A woman next to him murmured something about respect. It wasn't a full chorus of support. Not yet. But it was something, more than silence. Then the bell above the door jingled. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped inside. His uniform crisp, his presence calm but commanding. Deputy Kyle Bowl, Irene's nephew. He surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone used to walking into volatile situations. It felt like a bar fight might break out at any moment, and he was already weighing his options. He gave his aunt a small nod, silent but solid. Then he turned toward the center of the room. "I got a call about a possible assault," he said, voice flat and steady. Ethan paled. "That's ridiculous. It was just coffee." Kyle's gaze didn't waver. "You poured hot liquid on someone's head, son. That's not just coffee. That's battery." He didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for his handcuffs, but his hand hovered near his belt, a silent reminder that what had been done here had consequences. Raymond kept his eyes on the man kneeling before him, unmoving, unreadable. Silence blanketed the room like thick fog. Even the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter seemed to recede. Thomas Caldwell, still on his knees, looked up at Raymond with a trembling gaze. His tailored suit, once pristine, now bunched awkwardly at the elbows and knees, as if shame alone had folded him there. "You saved my life," he said again, as if he still couldn't believe the man before him was real. "You went back into that fire, twice. You didn't even hesitate." Raymond blinked slowly. "You were screaming. I remember that." His voice wasn't harsh, but it held no warmth either. Just memory. "You kept shouting about your kids, about how you needed to get home." Thomas bowed his head. "My daughter was just born," he said, almost in a whisper. "Emily, she just turned 2 months old. You," he paused, fighting emotion. "You gave me back everything, my life, my family. I never got to thank you." Raymond shifted slightly in his seat, the movement deliberate, but his posture remained guarded. "There were others," he said quietly. "Not all of them made it." Thomas looked up, eyes glistening. "I know," he said. "I've lived with that too." At the booth's edge, Ethan took a step back, his throat bobbed in a hard swallow. He couldn't look away from his father. The man he thought he knew had just shattered into someone else entirely. Someone deeper, someone braver, someone he hadn't respected until now. You never told me," Ethan murmured, voice breaking. "You never said a word about any of this." Thomas turned slowly, rising to his feet like the weight of the years had just settled back on his shoulders. His hands shook slightly as he looked at his son. "Because I wasn't the hero," he said plainly. "He was." Ethan's face twisted, confusion and shame mixing like oil and water. "It was just a prank," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "Just coffee. I didn't mean—" "You humiliated a man," Thomas said, calm but cutting. "A man who once walked into fire to save someone he didn't know." Irene moved closer to Raymond's booth, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp. She glanced at Kyle, who stood nearby like a quiet sentinel. He gave her the faintest nod. No words were needed between them now. Angela, still near the door, barely breathed. Her fingers gripped her notebook, but she'd stopped writing. This moment wasn't about reports or statements. It was about reckoning. Raymond finally looked at Ethan, not with anger, not with pity, just with the silent weight of a man who'd seen too much and expected nothing. "You don't know what you don't know," he said, "but that doesn't mean you get to treat people like they don't matter." Ethan looked away, his face red and jaw clenched. Colonel Hale stepped forward again, his presence a steady anchor in the room's rising tension. "Sergeant Cole," he said respectfully, "you've earned more than most ever will. If you ever need anything, you call me. Doesn't matter the hour." Raymond nodded once slowly. "Appreciate it, Colonel, but I got everything I need right here." He glanced at Irene, then at Angela, even Kyle, and finally at the cup of coffee still cooling on the table. Thomas took one step closer, then stopped, unsure. "Is there any way I can repay you?" he asked, voice low. Raymond studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he said, "Don't kneel again." Thomas blinked. "What?" "If you really mean it," Raymond said, eyes steady, "then stand up, walk tall, and go teach your son what it means to live with dignity. That's all the thanks I'll ever need." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken apologies, of hard-won respect, of stories never told but finally understood. And in that quiet, for the first time, Raymond Cole leaned back in the booth, took a sip of his now lukewarm coffee, and closed his eyes. Not in pain, but in peace. Words, when wielded with purpose, can cut deeper than any scream. Thomas Caldwell's voice trembled, not with fear, but with restrained fury. "You poured boiling coffee on the man who saved my life," he said. "The only reason you're standing here, the only reason I'm alive, is because that man carried me out of hellfire on his back." Ethan staggered backward a step, the cocky grin draining from his face. For the first time, the mask cracked. He looked around, searching for refuge in the stunned faces surrounding him. The barista frozen mid-movement, Angela's lips slightly parted in disbelief, Deputy Bull tense and motionless, Colonel Hale stone-faced. Then his gaze landed on his father, who remained on one knee before Raymond Cole, hands steady, voice rising with conviction. "You didn't just hurt a stranger," Thomas said, his tone now iron. "You dishonored a Marine, you dishonored this entire country, and worst of all, you dishonored me." Ethan had nothing left to say, because nothing could be said. His mouth hung open, but the silence around him rendered him mute. Thomas rose slowly, the years of service in every movement. He brushed the tears from his face, turned to Raymond, and said, "I owe you everything. I'm sorry for what happened, and for raising a son who thought decency was optional." Raymond stared at the man in front of him, the words settling on him like the familiar weight of a field pack. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "You made it home," Raymond said, voice hoarse but calm. "That's all that mattered back then." The quiet that followed didn't feel empty, it felt sacred. Ethan Caldwell, who had burst into the cafe full of bluster and bravado, now stood immobilized before the man he had mocked. And with the crowd watching, the truth hit him like a tide he couldn't escape. He would carry this moment, this shame, for the rest of his life. No one in that cafe would forget the name Raymond Cole again. For several long moments after Thomas Caldwell's final words, no one moved. Then, from near the window, a woman rose slowly. Her movements were hesitant, unsure. She walked up to Raymond with trembling hands and extended them toward him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't do anything. I should have." Raymond didn't speak. He simply nodded, his steady eyes meeting hers. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze, then stepped back, eyes wet with tears. One after another they came. A young man in a postal uniform walked over and offered a quiet, heartfelt thank you. An elderly couple rose from the corner booth and asked if they could hug him. A college student, her laptop still open on the table behind her, sobbed as she apologized, words breaking between gasps. Then three veterans from the quiet corner near the bookshelf stood up together, walked with purpose to Raymond's booth, and offered a solemn salute. Raymond returned the gesture, slow but precise, his fingers stiff, his shoulders aching, but the movement was dignified, clean, earned. Behind the counter, Irene Bull wiped her eyes with her sleeve. She reached for a piece of masking tape and scribbled something in bold black marker. Then she stepped out from behind the counter and pressed the tape firmly onto the wooden beam above Raymond's seat. Reserved for those who've served. She turned to face the room, her voice strong, not angry but full of resolve. As of today, she announced, coffee is free here for any veteran. Always. Applause erupted, not out of habit, but from the heart. It was sincere, thunderous, and unwavering. Irene didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her voice was law in this part of town, and everyone knew it. At that exact moment, the cafe doors swung open again. Not hesitantly this time, but with purpose. Colonel Marcus Hale returned, a folder tucked under one arm, a phone held to his ear. Yes, he said firmly into the receiver. Raymond Cole's VA file was never updated after his discharge. No dependents listed, no disability claims, no benefits on record. He paused. Well, we're fixing that today. He ended the call and strode straight to Raymond's table. I've spoken with a contact at the regional office, Hale said. Your file's being reactivated. You'll receive full disability benefits, a housing adjustment, retroactive pay, and a complete medical evaluation. Raymond blinked, stunned. That's a lot. It's overdue, Hale said without hesitation. Way overdue. Across the room, Ethan Caldwell remained rooted in place, arms crossed tightly, eyes fixed on the floor. His father finished a quiet, intense conversation near the counter, then walked toward him. Thomas placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. You're done, he said simply. Fired. Effective immediately. What? Ethan's voice cracked, disbelieving. Dad, come on. Thomas's expression didn't shift. You'll spend the next 6 months volunteering at the VA hospital. That's not up for discussion. I've already spoken to them. Ethan's shoulders slumped under the weight of consequences. In school? Thomas's jaw tightened, his eyes sharp with purpose. I called the university. You're suspended until further notice. There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation. Just the unshakable weight of accountability. If you want to earn your place back, in this family, in this world, you'll do it by serving the very people you tried to humiliate. Angela Cruz stood silently near the register, arms folded, eyes watchful. A faint, satisfied smirk played on her lips as she nodded once toward Raymond, a subtle message carried in the glance. You're not invisible anymore. In a town like theirs, news didn't spread. It exploded. By midday, the cafe was blowing up on local social media. A handful of photos made the rounds. Raymond standing tall, his shirt stained with coffee, Thomas Caldwell kneeling beside him, veterans nearby offering crisp salutes. Captions flooded in. This is what respect looks like. By evening, local reporters were already calling. City council members began issuing public statements. Inspired business owners followed Irene's lead, offering free meals, priority seating, even walk-in job interviews for veterans. The local college announced an emergency town hall on civil responsibility and the importance of honoring those who serve. That weekend, the line outside Boyle's Cafe wasn't there for lattes. People came to shake hands with a man who had said nothing while the world watched, and yet had chosen dignity over rage. Raymond Cole hadn't asked for attention, hadn't chased recognition, but for the first time in years, he felt something he'd quietly craved. He felt seen. He felt respected. 3 days later, Raymond walked through the glass atrium of Caldwell Industries, not as a relic from a forgotten war, but as the newly appointed operations supervisor in the company's logistics division. The irony struck him hard. He'd spent years hauling pallets in the middle of the night, graveyard shifts, temp work, his name barely remembered by supervisors. But now, here he was in a crisp company jacket, being led through headquarters by the same man whose life he once dragged out of a combat zone. Thomas Caldwell hadn't offered the job out of pity. It wasn't even about gratitude. "I don't need a figurehead," he had told Raymond bluntly. "I need a leader who understands people, and there's no one I trust more than you." It hadn't been an easy yes. Pride, especially the quiet, wounded kind, has deep roots. Raymond spent days wrestling with the decision, arguing with himself more than anyone else. But in the end, he'd accepted. Now he moved through the main distribution floor like he had once moved through forward operating bases. Sharp-eyed, composed, deliberate. Forklifts rolled past like tactical transports. Pallets rose in stacks like supply drops. Workers, most of them younger, straightened as he passed, not out of fear, but instinctive respect. They knew who he was. They'd seen the news, heard the story. But what impressed them wasn't the media coverage, it was the man himself. Raymond didn't command with ego. He asked questions, listened carefully, remembered names when something needed fixing. He fixed it quietly and never looked for praise. Within 2 weeks, shipping delays had dropped, scheduling was tighter, and morale had improved. But Raymond wasn't chasing metrics. What mattered to him were the 3 young employees he noticed struggling. 2 were veterans. One was the son of a Marine who never came home. None of them had said a word, but Raymond had recognized the silence, the stiffness, the weight. He saw in them what he'd once hidden in himself. By month's end, Caldwell Industries had launched a mentorship program to support veterans transitioning into the civilian workforce. Raymond's name topped the list. Every Friday afternoon, he met with new hires and recently returned service members. They talked about resumes, healthcare benefits, family reintegration, and the invisible burdens that don't go away with the uniform. He didn't give speeches, he told the truth. And somehow that was enough. One quiet morning, alone in the break room with a steaming mug of coffee, Raymond's phone buzzed on the table beside him. An unknown number flashed on the screen. Something deep in Trey told him to pick up the phone. "Dad?" came the voice on the other end. He sat up straighter in his chair. "Leah," her voice cracked, fragile with emotion. "I saw everything. I didn't know people still stood up for you like that." Raymond felt his throat constrict. "It wasn't about me," he said quietly. "It was," she insisted, her voice trembling. "And it should have been, a long time ago." She started crying. "I'm proud of you, Dad. So are the kids. They want to visit the café. They want to see the plaque." He swallowed hard, his voice almost too tight to speak. "I'd like that." He never needed the attention, never craved applause or awards. The recognition didn't matter. But hearing pride in his daughter's voice, that meant more than any medal ever could. That same afternoon, Raymond went back to his office. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that invited reflection. He stood in front of the whiteboard for a moment, then picked up a marker. He wrote 3 names with deliberate care: Leah, Avery, and Miles, his daughter and 2 grandkids. In the corner of the board, he wrote a single word in bold, capital letters: legacy. Because Raymond Cole had served his country. He had made it through the war. But only now, after all the years, after all the battles, was he learning what it truly meant to live, and more importantly, how to help others do the same. 3 months later, no one overlooked Raymond when he walked into Caldwell Industries. The newer employees didn't just see a supervisor, they saw something far more powerful. A man who wore his dignity like a uniform. A quiet leader who carried the weight of service and still stood tall. His office door stayed open. His thermos was always full of black coffee. Every Friday afternoon, his calendar was blocked off with one simple note: check-ins. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a lifeline. Young veterans came, hesitant at first, with the kinds of questions they didn't dare ask anywhere else. How do I explain the gap on my resume? What do I say when they ask about my service? What if I don't even know who I am anymore? Raymond didn't have rehearsed answers. What he had was space, patience, lived understanding. He offered something that no policy manual could teach: the truth that sometimes the hardest part of war comes after the battlefield. The silence, the sameness, the loneliness. and he reminded them gently and consistently that they were not invisible. Across town, at the corner of Madison and Sycamore, Boyle's Cafe still looked the same on the outside. But inside, something had changed, something real. Raymond's old booth by the window had been rebuilt, renewed. A local carpenter, himself a veteran, crafted a new backrest, smooth and strong. The tabletop was replaced with polished walnut, and just above the seat, a small bronze plaque was mounted to the wall, catching the light each morning. It read, "Reserved for those who've served," in honor of Sergeant Raymond Cole. Every day, someone different sat there. Sometimes it was an elderly Navy vet with a cane and a crossword puzzle. Sometimes it was a young Marine hunched over a laptop, eyes heavy with fatigue. Sometimes it was Raymond himself sitting quietly, only ever briefly. Because if another veteran walked in, Raymond would stand up and offer the seat, every time, without hesitation. Irene Bowl made sure the coffee in that booth was always free, no exceptions. No explanations, no bills. Her staff knew the rules. If anyone disrespected a veteran, they wouldn't just be asked to leave, they'd be escorted out by the same deputy who had shown up that day. And the town took notice. A bookstore down the street started offering military discounts. The local university began inviting veterans to share their stories in campus forums. A high school teacher rewrote her lesson plan to include a unit called Service Beyond the Uniform. Even Ethan Caldwell changed. Months of volunteering at the VA had stripped away his arrogance. He stopped defending himself, stopped trying to talk his way out of the pen. He showed up, cleaned floors, served lunch, listened. One day he asked quietly if he could meet Raymond. Raymond agreed, but not at the cafe. They met in the park under the changing leaves of autumn. They sat side by side on a bench, words slow to come. Ethan apologized. Raymond listened. He didn't offer forgiveness, not outright, but he offered something else, something even more valuable, a path forward. "You've got time to prove who you really are," Raymond said. "Use it." Then he stood, gave a nod, and walked away. The story of the cafe incident eventually faded from the headlines, but not from memory. It lived on in the town's quiet gestures, in policy changes, new conversations, and a collective shift in how veterans were seen. And in the heart of it all stood Raymond Cole, a man who never once raised his voice, yet managed to change the spirit of an entire community simply by showing up, standing firm, and refusing to disappear. One November morning, as sunlight streamed through golden leaves, sunlight spilled gently through the cafe windows, casting a warm glow on the bronze plaque mounted just above the old corner booth. A young girl, curious and wide-eyed, reached up and pressed her small hand against the metal. Her voice came in a hushed whisper as she turned to her mother and asked, "Who's that?" Her mother's smile held both pride and tenderness. "That's someone who protected others," she replied softly. "Someone who was kind." The little girl looked around the cafe, scanning the faces. "Is he here?" Her mother's gaze drifted toward the door, as if searching the air for a presence not easily seen. "Maybe," she said after a pause, "because Raymond Cole didn't need to be here to be remembered. He didn't need to be seen to leave his mark. His life wasn't defined by loud praise, medals, or a wall of accolades. Raymond's legacy was something quieter, something sturdier. It was built in the quiet strength of a man who carried more than his share of burdens and never once asked for recognition. He never demanded anything, never expected applause. He simply showed up, with quiet grace, steady as ever. And maybe, just maybe, that's what being a hero really means. Not the noise, not the ceremony, but a man who sits with his coffee alone and content, letting the world spin on around him while he waits, without complaint, to be remembered. In a time where everything is rushed, where loud voices drown out dignity, and where attention seems the currency of worth, Raymond Cole's story anchors us in something deeper. He reminds us that honor doesn't retire, that true courage isn't always brash or bold. It's often quiet, humble, and wrapped in decades of selflessness. Sometimes the ones we fail to notice are carrying the most incredible stories on their backs. Raymond never asked for a stage. He didn't shout, didn't argue. He didn't push back even when he probably should have. But his silence, his restraint, stirred something in the people around him. It woke them up. It reminded them that service doesn't end with a uniform or a farewell ceremony. It lives on, etched in every scar, every stride, every act done with dignity and purpose. There's a message here for all of us. Maybe it's a reminder to take a second look at the person sitting alone. Maybe it's encouragement to raise our voices when others fall quiet. Or maybe it's simply this: real strength doesn't need to announce itself. It shows up, it endures, and sometimes it wears flannel instead of a badge or a uniform. What stays with you from Raymond's story? Have you ever crossed paths with someone like him? Someone who never boasted, never drew attention, but whose quiet kindness echoed long after they left the room? We'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about how we can truly honor people like Raymond, not just with plaques mounted on cafe walls, but with our presence, with our attention, with the way we live our own lives. And if this story touched something in you the way it did in us, give it a like. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that heroes don't always march. They sit quietly, observing, remembering, carrying more than we'll ever know. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Real, human, and full of heart. Because sometimes the most powerful souls are the ones who never ask to be seen at all. Thank you for being here. And to all who've served or stood beside someone who has, we see you, we honor you, and we remember.